Welcome back to Dynamics Unplugged, and welcome back to day 3 of Dynamics A to Z, D365 Finance and Supply Chain Management. Day 3 is the letter C, and C is for cookie. Well, we all know that, but no, C in Dynamics 365 is about cost groups and costing in general, which is where I want to focus all of our discussion today. And to start with, there is a new module in Dynamics 365 that wasn't in legacy versions of Dynamics AX, which is the cost management module. A lot of the setups, the reports, the forms in the cost management module, you have access to in other modules like inventory management, for example, or production control or product information management. But with a focus on a role-tailored approach where we want to control the financial setups as a cost accountant or somebody in the finance work stream or operations work stream that's performing costing. This module focuses just on those relevant areas. You can see cost groups is one of those setups under inventory accounting policy setup. There are lots of different cost groups. The main purpose of cost groups is to assign categorization for cost analysis and cost calculations. So there are different groups of costs, for lack of a better word, that define how we want to categorize for the purposes of rolling up costs, for the purposes of doing a BOM calculation, for the purposes of a cost of goods sold, cost of good manufactured, or cost of good purchased, all of this flowing into something called a costing sheet. But to start off with, what are our cost groups? If I create a new cost group, you'll see that there's 5 different types of cost groups that can be set up. We're going to focus on 4 of them. Undefined is more or less a catch-all where you can assign it to many different data types, where the other 4 are used for specific purposes and can only be assigned to relevant data in the system based on those types. So direct materials. Direct materials is just that, your actual items, the material costs themselves, not the labor, not the overhead, not the surcharges, not the landed cost. What is the cost of this material? Typically assigned to your raw materials, can also be assigned to sub-assemblies and finished goods as well, because you might have multi-level costing and you want to see the aggregate cost for a semi-finished good or finished good. So what are the categorizations of materials? You can look at this a couple of ways. There's a basic approach, and you can see some of this in my demo data, where you just have things like raw materials, finished goods, and very simple categorizations. You might also want to take this a step further, especially if you deal with something like commodities or costs that fluctuate a lot differently, where metals might be different than wood, might be different than cloth, or your chemicals might be different than your hard goods, and your floor stock and consumables you might want to report on differently. You might have many cost groups of type direct materials to assign that level of reporting and calculation. So cost group types of direct materials are assigned to your released products. If we look at cost group types of direct manufacturing, this is your labor. This is going to be used in production orders when you're using routes and resources and resource groups and work cells to calculate the cost of labor in manufacturing. These are going to be assigned to your different areas of labor in the facility, and you can see when I select a cost group type of direct manufacturing versus something like direct materials, this related cost categories option shows up. A cost category helps us define what is the rate of cost or the rate of labor for that particular cost group. And you can see there is a cost price. This is a very expensive one of $300 an hour on the assembly cost category, which links to our labor 2 cost group, our assembly cost group. And that price is maintained in something called a costing version. All active prices, whether they be direct materials, labor, or overhead, go into a costing version. So we have our active costing version here, which is version 11, and we can see that $300 an hour is used for site 1. So we'd have different rates based on perhaps physical location or type of labor. An assembler might be different than a machinist. We have people maybe working with different types of machines or different maybe types of materials that need more delicate handling or certifications perhaps to use if you're dealing with chemicals or food manufacturing. And those rates are going to change based on the production that is occurring. So your cost categories and your cost groups of type direct manufacturing will define that and will calculate those rates and be used when you start to report production hours and be used when you start to estimate production as well. The third type that we have is indirect. Indirect is going to be your overhead. This is going to get linked to things like your cost groups for your labor, because you're going to have overhead associated with machines. You're going to have overhead associated with plants and facilities that you want to capture and you want to calculate. You might have other types of overhead or surcharges like inbound freight costs that you want to capture against purchase items and a calculation for cost of good purchase. So your indirect cost group, it's not going to be assigned to items. It's not going to be assigned directly in production routes, but it's going to be linked in the costing sheet between your cost groups of type labor back to these indirect type cost groups. So you might have surcharge type cost groups set up for this that are based on location. And then finally, we have direct outsourcing. This is going to be linked to release products that are of product type service. So when we send goods out for subcontracting, when we typically have a service item that represents the charge the vendor is paying for us, because we're shipping materials to them and they are doing labor on our behalf and shipping goods back. So this direct outsourcing gets linked to service items, so we can report those out separately and use them in a cost roll-up as well. Once you have all of your cost groups defined, there is a behavior if it's a fixed cost or a cost multiplied by the output of production or the hour rate of production, and you must have one default per type. So we have our cost groups set up. The next thing is actually linking them to the relevant data. So for direct materials cost group, once again, that's linked to your release products. Under the manage cost tab of the item, you have a cost group type, and this is pre-filtered. You're only allowed to select cost group of type direct materials or undefined unless the product type is type service. If the type is service, because this is used for that subcontract service charge, then the only cost groups that would show up here would be cost group type of direct outsourcing. So those two cost group types are assigned to your release products. Then we get into the cost groups that are used for labor and overhead. So first we'll look at labor. If I take a production route, for example, we'll take our mid-range speaker here and look at the route. Under the setup, we have cost categories. So this particular operation happens on assembly. And that cost category with that $300 an hour rate is using cost group of L2. So when they report labor against this production order, it's going to show under cost group 2. If there was 2 hours associated with the operation, we'd get $600 reported against cost group 2 for that resource. And which resource, that's defined in the production route. This one would be any resource group or resource that has the capabilities of speakers and assembly. So we're going to generate labor against that production order and use the different resource groups to calculate. If I look further down and maybe perhaps at some of these other lines, we can see if there is a different resource type used. And we get to the final one, there's a packing capability. So all those different resources might have different labor rates. They might have different cost groups and cost categories associated with them. This last one has a packaging cost group type, which might be at a different rate than the assembly cost group type we had. We go back to our cost management module. There's two other C's we can focus on. So I mentioned the costing version. This is where our active costs are kept under our standard cost type here. And it has our item prices. So these are all our active direct material or pending direct material costs. It has cost category prices. So these would be our labor rates that are either pending or active at our hourly rates. And you can see they are attached to sites. And then we have our indirect costs. So what are our labor overhead rates? You can see I have various overhead types set up in my sandbox. Some are surcharges, which are a percentage of the purchase price. That might be for something like inbound freight. I have machine depreciation that's going to be assigned to some resources to calculate that and assign that based on production. I have internal logistics overhead that I'm calculating as a surcharge. And then you even see some random indirect labor costs that are a rate per process time. So just a flat rate of overhead based on the process time output versus a percentage cost. All of those are maintained under that costing version. The other C is the calculation group. Calculation groups get assigned to items to help us base pricing. So you can see there's a couple different things I can do here. I can take different cost price models to base that pricing off. So am I using the cost price model, the current active cost price when I'm doing a cost roll up, or for certain items, am I using the purchase price on the item instead of the active standard, or maybe I'm using a trade agreement price. If I have an item that could be purchased and manufactured, this stop explosion checkbox allows me to treat that item like purchase. So I can maintain a BOM or formula, and I might have a default as production order, but this stop explosion will help me treat that like a purchased item. You also have a sales price model that can be based on that cost group or item sales price, and warnings you can enable. If this manufactured item is missing a BOM, a route, or a cost price, do I want a warning when I do a BOM calculation and roll up? So that is really helpful as well. So those are two extra C's. Back on the cost groups, the one thing we hadn't touched is the profit. So I might want to use a cost of goods sold or a cost of good manufactured to come up with my sales prices. So as I have different cost groups, I can assign different buckets underneath them to say, give me the cost, do a cost roll up of how much it manufactures this, plus a percentage to come up with a suggested profit or a suggested sales price. So that's what you see here assigned on this particular cost group of a profit percentage of 160. We can do a calculation against those materials and come up with a profit-based percentage of using that material. The final thing to show with C is the costing sheet. All of this really comes into an output of doing your cost of goods purchased, your costs of conversion, or cost of goods manufactured, it's very often called. So buckets of our material costs in this particular company, they're looking at material segregated by type. So electronics, cabinets, miscellaneous, and chemicals. Their labor, they're breaking down by different rates they want to have: packaging, assembly, polishing, quality assurance, cutting, and lab labor. And you can see the different cost groups associated with those. And then they have overhead on conversion. So overhead associated with manufacturing, which is being linked back to those cost groups. So only when this labor type is used should this overhead be applied. On this particular example, we have machine depreciation, and it's an output-based depreciation. It's based on the quantity of their output. So it has nothing to do with the amount of hours it takes. It's purely based on a throughput ratio of output per that machine. If I look at the cost of conversion for material overhead on option 3, this is based on a total percentage, a surcharge type essentially of labor. So they actually have per facility, per site 3, 1 and 4, 3% overhead of the total labor cost. So we're linking to this cost group type, overhead 3, and that gets associated back and charged. And then on the final option, a similar view, we have a subtype of process. So this is linking it directly to the labor rates, whereas this was still just a total percentage surcharge. This one is rate per process time. So based on the hourly rate of labor, linking this overhead to cost group overhead 4, they have a percent, an amount, a flat amount per process time. So $22 per hour, $2 per hour, $2 per hour, $2 per hour. So your overhead can be set up a number of different ways based on how you need to calculate it for your business, either based on output, based on time, based on a percentage of time and labor. So that's all well and good. We've looked at the setup, but what does it mean in reality? What does it mean when I'm looking at a production order? So we'll take all production orders, and we'll pull up an example of a production order that's been fully ended. And under manage costs, if we view the calculation details, the overview costing, you can actually see the cost group associated with all of these lines of costs that were attributed to this production. I see material cost groups, the M's, M9, M3, M9. I see my labor, L2, L4, L1. I see my overhead and the type of overhead, depreciation, internal logistics, indirect labor costs. And I see some more process labor time. So their naming convention was based on type M, L, O, and so on, but that might be based on machine or location, how you name those cost groups. This was an easy way for this company to memorize what those symbols represented. And if I go further in, for example, I go to the calculation sheet, I can see the breakdown of costs. And then I go to the costing sheet, and here is where those start to play in, because I can look at costs at different levels. Here I'm looking at everything blown out and what cost groups they would show up at and what levels of the costing sheet they're aggregating at. So you can see my packaging cost, my assembly cost, my Q&A, my quality assurance cost, my plant and overhead costs, and then my total cost of conversion, 138.18. So there's the estimation. This is what it was estimated at based on the BOM and the route and the expected output. And then there's the costing, the actual, which was slightly different, the total cost of conversion of 101.44. And I can look at that now at the total and just sum it up per area if I need to, rather than see the breakdown of each type of material, labor, and overhead. So as you can see, just starting with the basics of costing and costing setups, lots of things we can do with the letter C in Dynamics 365 Finance and Supply Chain Management. Until next time, with the letter D.